It was an unseasonably cold afternoon in downtown Manhattan when Barron Trump decided to slip away from the watchful eyes of his security detail. Tall and lanky, he blended effortlessly into the crowds of teenagers milling around the city. At 17 years old, Barron had grown accustomed to living under the shadow of his last name. Whether it was in school, public outings, or even casual conversations, he could never quite escape the weight of the Trump family legacy. Today, though, was different. Wearing a hoodie, jeans, and a pair of sneakers, he felt a rare sense of anonymity as he walked into the grand, sprawling structure of Westboro Mall. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Westboro Mall had long been a hub of energy, commerce, and commotion. Its towering glass facade reflected the swirling gray clouds outside while the bustling interior hummed with life. Families crowded stores for holiday discounts. Groups of friends laughed over snacks in the food court, and children ran excitedly from one toy store window to the next. For Barron, it was an opportunity to disappear into the ordinary, a slice of life he rarely got to experience. He strolled quietly, hands in his pockets, stopping to glance through windows and check out displays as any teenager would. Unknown to him, however, a pair of eyes had been watching him since he entered the mall. At the far end of the West Wing, sitting in a small, glass-enclosed office, a sharp-eyed mall manager named Harold Cobb peered through the monitors of the mall's security cameras. A stout man with a permanent scowl etched across his face, Harold took his job very seriously. Some would argue too seriously. He prided himself on maintaining order within the mall and had little patience for loiterers, troublemakers, or anyone he deemed out of place. Harold's eyes narrowed when the figure in the gray hoodie flashed across one of the screens. To him, the lanky teenager wandering aimlessly looked suspicious. Probably up to no good, Harold thought to himself. Years of managing the mall had left him with a jaded attitude toward teenagers, and today was no exception. He grabbed his radio and called the nearest security officer, grumbling into the microphone about the hoodie kid loitering near the electronics store. Oblivious to the scrutiny he was under, Barron wandered toward a large tech outlet, his interest piqued by a display of the latest gaming consoles. He knelt slightly to get a better look, his face partially hidden under the brim of his hood. Around him, other teens were testing gadgets or casually chatting, blending into the scene as effortlessly as Barron himself had, but within minutes, the calm was shattered. "Excuse me, sir!" a sharp voice barked, echoing slightly off the walls of the store. Barron turned his head to see a security officer, clad in a dark blue uniform, standing rigidly with a frown on his face. The officer motioned for Barron to stand up. Confused but compliant, Barron rose to his feet. "What's going on?" Barron asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of confusion. "You've been seen loitering," the officer said, crossing his arms sternly. "Let's go. Mall policy doesn't allow for this kind of behavior." Barron blinked, startled. "Loitering? I'm just looking at the display." The officer didn't budge. "You've been flagged by mall management. Come with me, please." By now, a few heads had turned to watch the exchange, their curiosity piqued by the commotion. Barron felt a mixture of embarrassment and irritation creeping up his neck. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, Harold Cobb appeared, striding into the store with authority. His eyes bore into Barron, scrutinizing him from head to toe. "What seems to be the problem here?" Harold asked gruffly, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "This one's been wandering around for a while," the security officer explained. "Hood up, no shopping bags, loitering near stores. Thought we'd intervene." Harold nodded in satisfaction. "Good work, young man. This isn't a hangout spot. You either shop or you leave. Got it?" Barron took a slow breath, trying to keep his composure. "I wasn't loitering. I'm just looking around. Is that not allowed?" Harold's scowl deepened. "We've had enough trouble with kids like you making a mess in this mall. I'm not asking twice. You need to leave now." The words stung more than Barron cared to admit. Kids like him? He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but he could already see that arguing would be pointless. Harold Cobb, self-proclaimed enforcer of mall policy, wasn't listening. A part of Barron wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. If Harold only knew who he was talking to, he might have reacted very differently. But Barron didn't want to play the "do you know who I am" card. He hated that game. All he wanted was a normal afternoon. By now, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring in quiet speculation. Someone pulled out a phone, likely recording the exchange. The weight of their stares pressed against Barron's shoulders as Harold waved a hand impatiently toward the exit. "Move it!" Harold snapped, his voice cutting through the awkward silence. Reluctantly, Barron turned and began to walk, his jaw clenched tightly to stop himself from saying something he might regret. The security officer trailed closely behind, ensuring he didn't linger as Harold escorted him through the mall. People turned their heads as he passed, their curiosity palpable. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but Barron kept his head down, wishing for all the world that the ground would swallow him up. The mall exit loomed ahead, the bright afternoon light spilling through the glass doors. Harold's voice continued to drone as he walked, lecturing Barron on mall policies and the importance of respecting the rules. It was only when they reached the entrance that the situation took an unexpected turn. From the far end of the parking lot, a black SUV pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the gray sky above. The car's presence alone commanded attention, its sleek exterior and polished rims looking out of place in the chaotic swirl of weekend shoppers. Harold paused mid-sentence, frowning slightly as he glanced at the vehicle. Barron, still silent, stepped toward the SUV just as the back door swung open. From inside, a tall, suited man emerged, a member of Barron's security detail. He approached quickly, his face tight with concern. "You okay, sir?" the man asked, casting a sharp glance at Harold and the security officer. Harold's frown faltered. "Sir?" he repeated, blinking in confusion. Barron nodded to his guard before turning to face Harold. His expression was calm, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Thanks for the hospitality," Barron said quietly, his voice measured but pointed. Before Harold could respond, the security officer beside him stiffened. Recognition flashed across his face, and he turned sharply to Harold, whispering something under his breath. Harold's eyes widened, his mouth falling open slightly as he looked back at Barron with dawning realization. "You!" Harold stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Wait! Barron didn't wait to hear the rest. He slid into the back seat of the SUV, the door closing smoothly behind him. The security guard gave Harold one last glance, a mix of disappointment and disapproval, before joining Barron in the car. With a low hum of the engine, the SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving Harold standing slack-jawed at the entrance of the mall. Inside the car, Barron let out a long sigh, slumping slightly against the seat. The security guard looked at him with a mix of amusement and sympathy. "Want me to say something to the mall management?" he asked. Barron shook his head. "No, it's not worth it." "Still, the guy had no idea," the guard muttered. "You'd think they'd recognize you." Barron let out a small, humorless laugh. "That's the whole point. I didn't want to be recognized." The SUV glided smoothly onto the main road, the chaos of the mall fading into the distance. Barron watched the scenery blur past his window, his expression thoughtful. In truth, he wasn't angry. Not really. If anything, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. For a brief moment, Harold Cobb had treated him like any other teenager. He hadn't been Barron Trump, son of a former president and a global household name. He had just been another kid in a hoodie, wandering the mall like thousands of others. Still, the irony wasn't lost on him. Harold's mistake would no doubt haunt him when he realized the full extent of what had happened. Barron could already imagine the headlines. Mall manager kicks out Barron Trump, twisting it into a frenzy of jokes, commentary, and speculation. And yet, Barron found himself oddly grateful for the experience. It reminded him of something he rarely got to feel: normalcy. Back at the mall, Harold Cobb was still rooted to the spot, his face pale as realization set in. Around him, people had begun to chatter, piecing together what had just happened. Some were already scrolling through their phones, pulling up news articles and photos of Barron Trump, whose towering height and distinctive features had suddenly become unmistakable. Harold's radio crackled to life, but he didn't hear it. His thoughts were spinning wildly. "I kicked out Barron Trump," he muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur for Harold. By the time he returned to his office, the weight of his mistake had fully sunk in. He slumped into his chair, staring blankly at the monitors as if they might offer some form of absolution. Around him, the mall carried on as usual. Shoppers coming and going, children laughing, and employees tending to their stations. But for Harold, nothing felt the same. He couldn't shake the image of Barron's calm, unreadable gaze as he'd walked out of the mall without another word. Somewhere deep down, Harold realized that this incident would follow him for a long time. Not because he had embarrassed himself, though he had, but because he had been so quick to judge. The hoodie, the wandering, the quiet demeanor, all of it had been harmless, and yet he'd seen only what he wanted to see. He'd assumed the worst, and in doing so, he'd made a mistake that would echo far beyond the glass walls of Westboro Mall. And in a sleek black SUV speeding down the streets of Manhattan, Barron Trump sat quietly, lost in his own thoughts. For all the fuss and drama that surrounded his name, Today had been, in its own strange way, an escape. Even if only for a brief moment, he had managed to step outside the expectations of who he was supposed to be. And as the city skyline loomed in the distance, Barron couldn't help but smile. As the SUV glided through the city streets, Barron Trump gazed out the tinted windows, his face a study in quiet contemplation. The towering skyscrapers of Manhattan blurred into abstract shapes, their lights flickering like distant stars. To any observer, it might have looked like Barron was distracted, detached even, but his mind was alive with thoughts that churned endlessly. The incident at the mall lingered in his head, not because it upset him, but because it represented something far deeper, a reflection of the strange, dual life he led. Barron had always understood the power of his name. It was both a blessing and a burden. The Trump name carried weight, drawing attention wherever he went, whether he wanted it or not. He'd seen it from an early age. The stares, the whispers, the deference that people often showed when they realized who he was. Sometimes it was awe, sometimes envy, and other times it was blatant judgment. What he experienced at the mall, however, was something far less predictable. He had been underestimated and dismissed entirely. In that brief encounter, Harold Cobb had made Barron feel invisible. Ironically, it was the very thing Barron often wished for, to disappear into the crowd, to be unremarkable for once. And yet, when it happened, it felt oddly hollow. The truth was, Barron didn't blame Harold. He understood how the man had come to his conclusions. Mall managers like Harold probably dealt with rowdy teenagers all the time. Groups of kids who loitered, caused trouble, or defied the rules just to feel rebellious. Barron had observed them himself. Kids his age with lives far removed from his own. Watching them laugh and push boundaries made him feel like an outsider, but it also intrigued him. He envied their freedom, the freedom to be ordinary, to make mistakes, to learn who they were without the weight of a name hanging over them. That freedom was something Barron could only glimpse from a distance. Inside the SUV, Barron's security detail remained silent, giving him space. They were used to his quiet moods, understanding that he didn't always want to be fussed over. As the car snaked through the bustling avenues, Barron thought back to his childhood. He had grown up in gilded rooms, surrounded by wealth and status, but there had always been something surreal about it. He remembered trips to playgrounds as a small boy, accompanied by guards who stood watch while other kids ran free. Even then, he had felt different. The other children would stare at him curiously before rushing off to climb jungle gyms or play tag. He never joined them, partly out of shyness, partly because he knew he couldn't. There was always someone nearby, always someone watching. These experiences had shaped Barron into who he was today, a young man with a quiet demeanor and a natural wariness about people. He had learned to be observant, to notice small details about others, and to read the intentions behind their actions. At the mall, Harold Cobb's disapproving gaze had told Barron everything he needed to know about the man. Harold wasn't malicious. He was simply a person who believed in rules and order, someone who had let his assumptions blind him. It was a mistake anyone could make, and Barron knew that better than most. The SUV pulled to a stop outside his family's private residence, its grand facade bathed in the soft glow of evening lights. The security guard opened Barron's door, and he stepped out into the crisp air, his sneakers crunching softly against the gravel drive. He lingered for a moment, looking up at the towering building. To many, this place symbolized power and wealth, but to Barron, it was simply home. Another place where the weight of his name followed him. As he entered, the hum of the city faded behind the heavy doors, replaced by the quiet calm of the house. Barron's mother, Melania, was in the sitting room, flipping through a glossy magazine. She looked up when he entered, her sharp, knowing gaze taking in his expression. "You're back," she said softly, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "How was it?" Barron shrugged, dropping his hoodie onto a nearby chair. "Eventful." Melania tilted her head slightly, sensing that there was more to the story. "Did something happen?" Barron hesitated, then gave a small chuckle. "A mall manager kicked me out for loitering." Her eyebrows lifted in surprise, but she didn't immediately react. Melania was not one to overreact. She knew her son better than anyone and trusted him to handle himself. "Did he know who you were?" "No," Barron replied, a faint smirk on his lips. "That's the funny part." For a moment, Melania simply studied him, trying to gauge his thoughts. Finally, she shook her head with a small, indulgent smile. "And what did you learn from this experience?" Barron considered the question. What had he learned? That being treated like an ordinary teenager wasn't always what it seemed? That anonymity could sometimes feel as isolating as fame? "I guess people see what they want to see," he said at last. "It doesn't matter who you really are." Melania nodded approvingly. Yes, that is often true. People are quick to judge, but you cannot let that define you. You know who you are. That is what matters. Barron appreciated her words, but he also knew that knowing who he was and being seen for who he truly was were two very different things. Even now, people continued to make assumptions about him. To some, he was merely Donald Trump's son, a figure defined by his father's shadow. To others, he was a young man of privilege who had never faced any real challenges. Few people ever stopped to consider the pressures he faced, the expectations that came with his name, or the moments when he wished for a life outside the spotlight. He thought again about Harold Cobb, who had judged him on sight without knowing a single thing about him. The encounter, though brief, had revealed a truth Barron often grappled with. People rarely looked beyond the surface. Harold had seen a tall teenager in a hoodie and assumed trouble. How many others in Barron's life had made similar judgments without realizing it? It was an uncomfortable thought, one that stuck with him even as he tried to shake it off. Over the next few days, the incident at the mall began to gain traction online, exactly as Barron had predicted. Someone had captured the moment on video. The brief confrontation with Harold, the security escorting him toward the exit, the black SUV waiting just outside. While the video wasn't dramatic, the caption attached to it was enough to spark attention. Mall manager kicks out Barron Trump, doesn't know who he is. The clip went viral almost immediately. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a humorous and ironic story. Social media was ablaze with reactions ranging from amusement to sympathy. Some people criticized Harold Cobb for being too heavy-handed, while others applauded him for treating Barron like any other teenager. The debate unfolded across platforms, with armchair commentators weighing in on every angle. For his part, Barron tried to ignore the noise. He had spent enough of his life in the public eye to know that stories like these burned bright and then faded quickly. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how Harold felt now that the truth had come to light. Did he regret his actions? Was he embarrassed? Or was he simply going about his day, unfazed by the whirlwind of attention? Harold Cobb, however, was far from unfazed. The moment the story broke, he had been inundated with phone calls, emails, and curious glances from mall employees. He tried to maintain his stoic exterior, but inside he was mortified. The realization that he had kicked out the son of one of the most famous figures in the world gnawed at him, a constant reminder of his mistake. And yet, even as the media latched onto the story, Harold couldn't shake the thought that he had been doing his job. "Rules are rules," he muttered to himself one evening, staring at his reflection in the window of his small office. "I couldn't have known." But deep down, he knew the incident had exposed a flaw in his approach, a tendency to judge too quickly, to assume the worst without taking a moment to understand. It wasn't an easy truth to face, but Harold was nothing if not self-reflective. In his own gruff way, he began to question whether his rigid approach to mall management had blinded him to the humanity of the people he interacted with. He thought about Barron Trump, not as the son of a former president, but as a teenager who had simply wanted to spend an afternoon at the mall. The boy hadn't caused any trouble, hadn't broken any rules. All he had done was exist in a way that Harold had deemed suspicious. It was a sobering realization. Over time, the frenzy around the incident died down, as all viral stories eventually do. Harold Cobb returned to his routine, though he carried with him a newfound awareness of his own biases. He became more thoughtful in his approach, taking the time to observe situations before jumping to conclusions. For the employees and visitors of Westboro Mall, the change was subtle but noticeable. Harold was still strict, still committed to maintaining order, but there was a softness to him now, a willingness to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes. As for Barron, the incident became another story in the ever-growing archive of his life, a brief moment that highlighted the strangeness of his existence. But unlike so many other stories, this one had a silver lining. It reminded him of the humanity that connected everyone, regardless of status or background. Harold Cobb had misjudged him, yes, but in doing so, he had given Barron something rare, the chance to be treated like any other person, if only for a moment. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't pleasant, but it was real. In the months that followed, Barron continued to carve out his own path, navigating the complexities of life under the public eye. He studied, pursued his interests, and spent time with the people who truly knew him, the people who saw him for who he was, not just for his name. And every now and then, he would think back to that cold afternoon at Westboro Mall. It was a reminder that perception could be deceiving, that people often saw what they wanted to see. But it was also a reminder of something far more important, the value of understanding. of looking beyond the surface to find the truth beneath. And somewhere in a small office overlooking the bustling corridors of Westboro Mall, Harold Cobb sat at his desk, sipping coffee as he scanned the security monitors. He had become a little less quick to judge, a little more willing to pause and observe. Every now and then, he would remember that tall teenager in the gray hoodie, the boy he had kicked out without realizing who he was. It was a memory that stayed with him, a lesson learned the hard way, but one that made him better. Harold couldn't change the past, but he could change the way he approached the future, and in a strange way that made all the difference. For Barron and Harold alike, the encounter had been unexpected, awkward, and undeniably human. Two lives, so vastly different, had crossed paths in a way neither could have predicted, leaving behind a story that would quietly resonate long after the headlines had faded. The SUV's hum faded into the background as Barron Trump settled into the familiar rhythm of his life. The media frenzy around his mall incident had begun to wane, and the next viral headline took its place, as it always did. Barron didn't bother to track the endless cycle of news and public opinion. He'd grown up watching the world devour stories, spit them out, and move on. To him, the headlines meant little, even when they were about him. What lingered, though, was the feeling. That brief, bitter taste of being dismissed, ignored, and judged before anyone knew who he really was. It wasn't the judgment that bothered him most. No, Barron had grown used to assumptions about his life. To many people, his name represented a world of unimaginable privilege and ease. He'd lost count of how many strangers, even classmates, assumed he must live a life free of struggle or hardship, that his days were defined by extravagant parties and endless luxuries. The truth, however, was more complex. Barron's life, though undeniably privileged, carried with it challenges few could understand. It wasn't the wealth or status that defined him, but the constant, suffocating scrutiny. Every choice, every expression, and every word measured, dissected, and judged by people who knew nothing about him. The mall incident gnawed at him not because it was humiliating, though being escorted out of a mall like a troublemaker had been embarrassing. No, what stuck with Barron was how quickly the mall manager, Harold Cobb, had dismissed him. Barron wasn't some misfit loitering for attention, but Harold hadn't cared to look closer. What troubled Barron was the realization that most people lived this way, constantly judged on surface appearances, trapped in roles they hadn't chosen. Barron thought back to his mother's words, "People see what they want to see." He'd heard similar sentiments before, but this time it felt personal. Harold Cobb hadn't seen a teenager who was quiet, thoughtful, and curious about the world. He'd only seen a tall boy in a hoodie, a stereotype, nothing more. And Barron knew that this happened to countless people every day, in far harsher ways than he'd experienced. There were teenagers across the country who, unlike him, didn't have the protection of privilege to cushion those judgments. Kids who were unfairly profiled, mistreated, and shut out because of their clothing, their expressions, or simply because of where they were born. As these thoughts simmered in Barron's mind, they sparked something unexpected: curiosity. For years, he'd felt disconnected from the world beyond his carefully managed sphere of existence, as though he watched life through a tinted window while everyone else lived it. But the mall incident gave him a small taste of what it meant to walk in someone else's shoes, just for a moment. And now Barron wanted more. He wanted to see and understand the world through different lenses, beyond the confines of what he'd always known. A week later, Barron found himself back in Manhattan, though this time, he had no intention of blending in or wandering aimlessly. He had asked his security detail for space. Reluctantly, they agreed to let him walk alone as long as he stayed in view. Barron had a specific plan in mind. He'd spent the past few days researching stories of kids and young adults who had been unfairly judged, overlooked, or mistreated simply because of assumptions made about them. The more he read, the more he realized how pervasive the problem was. Barron decided he wanted to learn firsthand, to see the world from perspectives he'd never considered. When Barron entered the center's gymnasium, his towering height immediately drew attention. A group of teenagers playing basketball paused mid-game, their expressions wary and curious. Barron felt their eyes on him, but this time it wasn't because of his name. It was because he was an outsider, unfamiliar and unexpected. He raised his hand in a small, awkward wave. "Hey," he said, trying to sound casual. The teens exchanged glances before one of them, a boy about Barron's age with a confident, almost defiant demeanor, stepped forward. "You lost or something?" Barron shook his head. "No, I'm here to volunteer. I wanted to learn more about the programs here." The boy squinted at him, skeptical. "You look like you don't belong here." Barron offered a small smile, the irony of the statement not lost on him. Maybe I don't, but I'm trying to. The boy's name was Jamal, and as the afternoon wore on, he gradually warmed up to Barron. They talked about basketball. Barron, despite his height, admitted he wasn't much of a player, and then about life. Jamal's world was vastly different from Barron's. He'd grown up in a low-income neighborhood, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. Jamal shared stories of how teachers, coaches, and strangers had dismissed him because of his clothes, his neighborhood, or the way he carried himself. "They look at me like I'm trouble," Jamal said, dribbling the basketball lazily. "They don't even know me." Barron nodded, listening intently. "People make assumptions," he said quietly. "It's not fair." Jamal looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What about you? What do people assume about you?" Barron hesitated, considering the question. "That I have everything, that my life is perfect." "Is it?" Barron thought for a moment before answering. "No, not even close." Jamal tilted his head, waiting for more, but Barron didn't elaborate. Instead, he picked up a basketball and awkwardly attempted a shot, missing by a wide margin. Jamal laughed, and for the first time, the tension between them dissolved. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversations, laughter, and quiet moments of reflection. Barron didn't share his full story with Jamal or the other kids at the center. He didn't want to make it about himself. Instead, he listened, asked questions, and tried to understand their experiences. By the time he left, Barron felt a strange sense of clarity. The stories he'd heard echoed in his mind, reinforcing what he'd begun to realize. People were so much more than the assumptions made about them. Whether it was Harold Cobb dismissing him at the mall or society judging kids like Jamal based on their circumstances, the root of the problem was the same. People rarely took the time to see beyond the surface, to truly understand one another. Barron's visits to the community center became a quiet routine. He didn't tell his friends, didn't post about it online, and certainly didn't allow the media to catch wind of it. He went because it felt real, because for the first time, he was connecting with people who saw him not as Barron Trump, but as just another kid trying to figure life out. The teenagers at the center challenged him, joked with him, and taught him things he'd never learned in classrooms or private estates. Jamal, in particular, became something of a friend, though neither of them would have admitted it outright. One afternoon, as they sat on the bleachers watching a pickup game, Jamal turned to Barron with a thoughtful expression. "You know, you're not what I thought you'd be." Barron raised an eyebrow. "What did you think I'd be?" Jamal shrugged. "Stuck up. Rich kid who thinks he's better than everyone." Barron laughed softly. "Fair enough. I've probably thought things about people that weren't true, too." Jamal nodded, looking out at the court. "It's what people do, but it doesn't mean we have to keep doing it." The words stuck with Barron long after he left the center that day. Jamal was right. Assumptions were part of human nature, but they didn't have to define how people treated one another. Barron thought back to Harold Cobb, the mall manager who had dismissed him so quickly. What if Harold had paused for just a moment to see him differently? And what if Barron himself had taken the time to see Harold differently, not as a gruff authority figure, but as a man doing his job the best way he knew how? If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the mall manager kicking out Barron Trump? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.